Mr. Chair. I bring you warm greetings from the Economic, Social and Cultural Council of the African Union, which is the advisory body of the African Union with regards to sustainable development, led and driven by CSOs. And today, as has been highlighted, I will be giving a presentation on financing gender machineries in African Union member states. And this is given off of key study findings that were made by experts from our gender cluster. It's ironic that they have a young person presenting for them today, but I think if you were to go into aspiration 5 of Agenda 2063, it speaks of a development within the continent that is driven by women and youth. And therefore, I think the nexus of both of us is very key and important. And not only that, it's important to have all key players on the ground in terms of making this a reality. And therefore, as a result of this, we made a study that was based on global frameworks which include the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action on Gender Equality, the Agenda 2030 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals Initiative, the African Union Agenda 2063, as well as other legal instruments within the African Union context, which are the Constitutive Act of the African Union, as well as the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, as well as the Solemn Declaration on Gender Equality in Africa. Now, in terms of conceptual considerations, we looked at what exactly do we mean by gender machineries. So we looked more into formal government structures assigned to promote gender equality and improve the status and rights of women. And then go further into asking, are these gender machineries supposed to be a one-size-fits-all? And going further into understanding whether it's a resource factor or an efficiency factor that causes these machineries to be an impactful part of development within their respective countries. And further on in terms of concept, we looked at, should studying gender machineries effectiveness focus on overall institutional performance or on specific policy aspects? Now, this was going further into asking whether individual policy areas in the role of gender machineries are national oriented, or could we look more from a point of units based on local implementation, whether it be districts, municipalities, or provinces or states, as some depending on the type of public administration that is being used. So in terms of objectives, we looked at the review of the existing allocations in terms of national budgets. We focused on 3 countries specifically. I know we are dealing with West and Central Africa in this particular one, but the African being the African Union, we decided to also include East Africa in our studies. So we've got an East African case study, we've got a Central African case study, and we've got a West African case study. And then we went to assess the extent to which African governments have adopted gender-responsive budgeting as a tool to ensure that sectoral ministries are allocating resources that target women and close gender gaps within each sector. And then we looked also at proposing the minimum percentage allocations to ministries for gender, which can allow for them to fully implement their mandate, and furthermore recommend models and actions that can ensure closer collaboration between ministries of gender and women's affairs and ministries of finance for the tracking of resource allocations as well as their execution. And I think it's also important to note on this that we also wanted to make sure that it's not a matter of budget absorption, but actual execution for the achievement of results. Most public administrators will know that when we deal with budgets, a lot of our balancing goes more into making sure we're breaking even and having a clean audit, and usually doesn't look at the performance indicators themselves. And I think that's something we're trying to push for in terms of making sure that gender parity is indeed implemented. So in terms of data collection, as I've stated, we looked at 3 countries that were in West, Central, and Eastern Africa. And even though it is not fully representative of all parts of Africa, it is indicative and sufficient to start a conversation, which will inevitably lead to what is part of our mandate as the Economic, Social and Cultural Council, which is to provide advisory inputs into the continental perspective of development within the continent. So this particular study is more as a platform from which we would have stakeholders such as yourself join us in making sure that indeed we bring about the type of interventions that take this particular topic forward. Now, in terms of a proposed approach and working plan, in each country, we had a study team that conducted interviews and selected a number of respondents. And these respondents came from relevant sector agencies that comprise of gender machinery within each country. And since this study was a rapid assessment, the researchers sampled at least 10 to 15 respondents in each of the countries that were targeted. Now, the respondents answered a generic set of questions that are aligned to the objectives of the study, and interviews were also conducted during the African Union pre-summit events. Now, in terms of the lines of inquiry into the data collection, which is the questions that were asked, we went into finding out what is the structure of gender machinery in each country, what is the policy and legal framework for the gender machinery, what are the key programmatic focuses of the gender machinery in that country. Is the current model sufficient, or are there preferred models that are being advocated for from a civil society level and even a policy level that might not necessarily be receiving the type of gravitas that is due to them? As well as what is the suggested percentage of national budget that should be allocated in terms of financing these gender machineries. Now, in terms of findings, with regards to the percentage allocations, the respondents noted that achieving gender outcomes is not the sole responsibility of the national government machinery alone. In fact, one of the respondents actually made a very powerful quote which said, even if all the money in the national budget was given to the Ministry of Gender, it will not be able to achieve all the gender results that are expected. At the end of the day, it takes more than just resources to make this work. It needs political will, and it also needs the type of empowerment that puts women in the forefront of their actual empowerment, and not necessarily just as a subsidiary or a beneficiary. And from the interviews, a conceptual conclusion was that governments need to consider increasing sectoral ministry budgets in a manner that targets the strategic gender actions that all ministries can undertake to achieve gender results. And mainstream budgets, that embedding gender and mainstream budgets is possible. The story of the three countries show that it is possible to integrate gender in mainstream budgeting processes of government at national and subnational level. And number two, starting with small yields results. At the end of the day, I would say that one small win is better than aiming for one big win and then losing everything at the end of the day. And especially within our continent's context, gender parity has had a very difficult past. And it's therefore essential that even as we move forward, we indeed look towards giving as many quick wins as possible to create the momentum to produce the type of change that we would like to see. Very good example is with Rwanda, where you now know that 68% of their cabinet now is actually women, and which is as a result of years and years of having gone through not only just tribal conflict, but also then going into the gender conflict and everything else. And many other countries that have similar stories that started off with small wins and then inevitably end up with the type of successes that we're hoping to get. Therefore, in terms of getting a model of collaboration, the study explored the models that were happening between the different agencies. And one of them was a task team on gender budgeting, allocations, and expenditure analysis. In one of these countries, experience showed that there was values for a diversity of government agencies discussing issues of gender collectivity. This task team was therefore a good strategy. However, it should ensure that the right technical persons are the ones involved in the meeting so that the issues being discussed are in the practitioner's environment and context. Again, you cannot talk about women without women at the table. And I think that's one of the things that is being emphasized in this particular study. And then again, putting in...
Mr. Manisha, you have 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay, thank you. I thought you were going to let me know when it was 12. Not a problem. But then once again, in terms of putting in place a gender and macroeconomics technical working group, ensuring that indeed in the form of the mainstream budgeting at national level, women are a priority. The exact same way that you put education, the way that you put health, the way that you put security, women empowerment should be a part of the macroeconomic models that are being supported or being implemented by the Ministry of Finance. And therefore, the study recommendations, one of them being making sure that policy focus as an entry point is a priority amongst all countries. Second of all, making sure that location and policy power of the gender machinery leverages on all the voices of the women within their countries, not only just in terms of activism, but also from private sector as well as academia, CSOs, and all the likes. And then again, in terms of political leadership and support, we have been stressing this throughout the study that this cannot work unless at the political realm there is the understanding that women need to be right at the forefront. Women need to be the ones helping to set the pace and the tone of how these budgets are being produced and how they're being executed, and moreover evaluated and monitored. So with that, I'll leave you, and if there are any questions, feel free to ask my colleague William. He is
So I'm moving over the word now to Mr. Rasafima Hefa, that's Deputy Division Chief of the Mission Chief to Togo of the African Department.
Thank you, Chief. And many thanks for that, for organizing this event. It's very good to see the room packed today. It shows that there is a strong interest on this issue. I'll maybe give a few comments on the presentation and maybe some of the points that the previous speakers made, and then I'll make comments on my one afterwards. Just to complement a little bit the first presentation and to give a bit of maybe a bit of an update, I would say. We say that debt increased a lot, and indeed it has increased a lot, and it is really alarming the rate at which debt has increased. And at the same time, I'd just like to note that I would say not all the debt has been wasted in Africa, because if you look at development in Africa from a social outcome, from economic outcome, we saw that, for instance, poverty rate declined by about 20 percentage points for the last 1 decade or two. So, and if you look at, for instance, school enrollment rate, it increased a lot in Africa for the last decade or so. So I think it is good to put a little bit in perspective that Africa used part of that debt to improve social and economic outcome, just to have a little bit the balance. And the second point is that you probably heard that debt has been stabilizing in Africa since 2017 and 2018. So it increased very rapidly at very alarming rate from 2013 until 2016 or so. And then it has started to stabilize somehow in 2017 and 2018. Of course, the stabilization is a little bit hiding like the different patterns behind it, but for some countries it decreased, for some others it continued to increase. So just a little bit of, I would say, of an update. Now I'm going to turn to my own comments. I think CSOs, that they have a very, very important role to play in terms of getting the right balance between achieving sustainable development while maintaining or safeguarding the sustainability of public debt. And I'm gonna give 3 points that I think CSOs can play an important role in terms of finding that right balance. The first point that I'd like to make is on the role of the government. And the government has a role to play, obviously, in terms of finding that right balance. But I think CSOs can push and help the government to play that role. And as mentioned earlier, we need to increase revenue. because if we increase revenue, we can contain the increase in debt. And for instance, just going to give you one example. A recent study by the IMF has shown that in sub-Saharan Africa, the level of tax collection is about 3 to 5 percentage point of GDP below the level where it should be. What we call the tax potential. So the difference between actual tax collection and the tax potential is about 3 to 5 percentage point of GDP. So I think CSOs have an important role to play to educate taxpayers to pay taxes, but also to push the government to collect those taxes. One point. Another point still on the government side, as mentioned earlier, we need to improve PFM, public financial management, to make sure that whatever is spent in the budget for investment translates into economic growth. And there are two channels through which that can happen. The first channel is how much an investment in the budget translates in public capital stock. For instance, if you invest $100 billion in the budget, does that translate into $100 billion in roads constructed, in bridges constructed? It is a bit sad to say that in Africa, many studies have shown that the rate to which public investment translates into capital stock is only about 50%, meaning the rest of the investment, the 50% of investment, is lost in leakages and different channels of leakages. And I think CSOs have a great role to play to push the government to improve the public financial management and reduce those leakages. And by doing that, we can reduce also borrowing and reduce the burden on debt. The second area where I think an important measure can be taken and where CSOs can play an important role is together with development partners, related to development partners. We probably know that there was a commitment by development partners to deliver 0.7% of the GNI as official development assistance. At this stage, what donors are providing is only about 0.3% of the GNI. And I think CSOs in Africa and outside Africa should push development partners, governments in those donor countries to increase the ODA to the level that they have committed themselves. And I think it is important for CSOs to make noises and to play that role. And the last point I would like to make is on the private sector. The private sector also has a role to play to find the equilibrium between sustainable development and sustainable debt. Government cannot finance everything. There was a study by the IMF recently that to reach the SDGs by 2030, Sub-Saharan Africa needs about 15% of GDP of additional expenditure to finance development needs and reach the SDGs. And that is a huge amount. And the government by itself will not be able to finance 15% of GDP. And the private sector needs to come in. And I think CSOs can play an important role to invite the private sector to come in to make the business environment conducive enough and favorable enough for private investment to come in. So to summarize, I would say there are three ways we can find the right balance between sustainable debt and sustainable development. One way is the role of the government. The second way is the role of development partners. And the third way is the role of the private sector. And to me, CSOs can play a cross-cutting role across those three ways to find the right balance, the good equilibrium between sustainable development and sustainable debt. Thank you, Chair.
What we see from that presentation is that a certain type of debt, I think it's off the radar, and I'm talking about a domestic debt. And if you look at the trends in domestic debt in a number of countries, particularly where I work, we see that domestic debt is rising. And the critical thing is maybe unlike external debt, which we know could be earmarked to certain projects. I think that's not the case for domestic debt, where governments will just borrow, the resources go part of the budget, and in the end, some of these could be used for consumption activities. So I think this is where civil society can also come in to ensure or demand accountability from governments in terms of how such resources, particularly domestic or resources that are borrowed domestically, how are they used? The last speaker mentioned about capital formation, but for domestic debt, how do we ensure that the resources that are borrowed are used at least to build capacity for repayment at a later date, rather than using resources for consumption? So that's one thing which I think civil society can play a critical role. And then secondly, it's about the institutions which are involved in public debt management. Yes, we're talking about government departments responsible for public debt, but the national assemblies are also very critical in this regard. We can ask governments to, we can demand accountability from the governments, but if the national assemblies are weak, I can tell you that most of the loan authorization bills will be going through national assemblies, and the speed at which these loan authorization bills go or are approved by national assemblies is quite supersonic, I tell you. It's simply because maybe the representatives in the national assemblies do not even understand about public debt management, or what the terms of the loans in those bills are all about. So building capacities of the national assemblies is quite critical, and I think that civil society organizations can play a critical role to ensure that these national assemblies are capacitated and they're able to do their work. So those are some of the comments I wanted to make. Thank you so much.
Being an organization called Match for Peace, Development and Human Rights. Actually, I have a comment and a question. First, I believe that there is a very vital point to implement all the recommendations and all the optimistic plans that we're talking about, which is that real research should be conducted on ordinary, regular women who just have a very regular life. So many studies that we see, some of them are non-Africans, actually have different statistics, different information, and that is because it is not conducted on women who live like ordinary life in a village. So that is the point that I think we should work on. My question is that would be addressed to Mr. Clarkson. You talked about gender equality and national rights, concentrating on financing. But what do you think are the other challenges and other obstacles facing women in Africa? You talked about SDG number 5, gender equality. How about SDG number 4, education, or economic growth, SDG number 8, and most importantly in Africa, SDG number 16, peace and security? And thank you so much.
Thanks very much. I'm going to stop here for these first two questions. With the third question, sorry. So please go ahead, and I will ask you to react very quickly.
Hi there, my name is Miriam. I work for the Bretton Woods Project in London. Thank you so much for all your presentations, it was really insightful. I've just got some quick questions. The first to the representative from the World Bank as to what role the contingent debt liabilities on the rollout of public-private partnerships against advice is playing in the subsequent debt build-up. Question to the IMF. A recent report showed that there was $93 billion of reckless lending to high debt countries by the IMF, and Ghana was one of them, which was seen as a high risk, in high risk of default and given a loan anyway without debt restructuring. Given that IMF research has showed that restructuring does actually create more successful outcomes, is this something we're looking to kind of mainstream into the IMF discourse? This has been something that civil society has campaigned for a long time, alongside the creation of an independent debt workout mechanism. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And lastly, while all of your speeches were excellent, I do agree that you can't speak about women without having women at the table. And it would be good to see at least one woman at your table.
Thank you for your questions and thank you for that great point of view. Yes. So I will ask you for quick answers if you can for this first round of questions. And we can start from the inverse order. So over to you.
Sure. I'm happy to do that. On the very first question regarding the need to ensure that the resources borrowed are allocated and used to build, let's say, the economic capacity for the country to be able to repay the debt. So, as mentioned earlier, it is important to make sure that investment translates into capital stock, and capital stock translates into economic growth. And through those two channels, economic growth will help repay the borrowed resources. I gave you an example earlier that for the first part of this channel, that in Africa, unfortunately, only 40% of investment translates into capital stock. But for the other part of it, meaning how to make sure that the capital stock itself translates into economic growth. I'm going to give you one example, an actual example, which was not in Africa, but was in Switzerland. In Switzerland, they built a bridge that was meant to be for pedestrians. And then they put a camera at the start of the bridge to see how many people use the bridge. After 1 year, they looked at the camera, only one squirrel crossed the bridge in 1 year. And now the bridge is called the Squirrel Bridge. And this is exactly the type of investment that we do not want to make, meaning probably in Switzerland, because they have very good PFM capacity, everything that is invested translates into the bridge, capital stock, but the bridge itself did not translate into an economic growth at all. So I think this is what we need to make sure that those two channels took place. And the World Bank and the IMF, we work countries in Africa to make sure that investment translates into capital stock translates into economic growth. For instance, we do that what we call investment prioritization, to make sure that we prioritize investment and choose the ones that are the most useful in terms of growth and build capacity to repay the debt. On the 93 billion reckless lending, indeed it has made a lot of noise in the press. Why the IMF still continues to finance? There are many details behind those numbers, and for instance, you mentioned the case of Ghana, which indeed has been mentioned a lot. And for us, for the IMF, before we give financial support to a country, we conduct what we call the debt sustainability analysis. I think all of us in the room know what debt sustainability analysis is. And we have some conditions before we embark into a financial support to a specific country. First, we have to ensure that that debt is sustainable. In some cases, we call it debt is sustainable with high probability. So, meaning that there's been maybe some small probability that need to be discussed, but we have this framework. And all countries to which we lend to, we have to make sure that that framework is in place. And maybe very last point before Mr. Chair cut me is just to say that there were some debt that probably can be called hidden debt, for which we were not aware of the existence of those debts before we provided the lending. That we discovered, the same as other people, only after we have provided the lending, we discovered that there were some hidden debt that were not disclosed to us, that had not been disclosed to us when we agreed to provide the lending. Thank you, Chair.
I had only one question, so I'll answer that. And with regards to the challenges that I see, that I identified, particularly in terms of women inclusion in financing machineries, I would say it's more a cultural issue. The cultural issue, especially within the African context. A lot of the misnomers that were integrated into public life are still a bit of a matter of addressing, and the only way to address such is to have best practices, have exceptional examples, and also making sure that whenever you have women representing, it's not just a matter of saying that there's a woman representing, but it's someone who's actually tried, tested, who knows what the issues are on the ground, who has access to the women within the normal stream of life, and also can contribute substantially into making policy decisions, and also demanding that meetings like this and forums like this particular one should not go forward without at least having one woman talking, as the madam has rightfully said. I think that will be a very good step as well, to make sure that indeed that voice is a strong part of our deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had some other word. Oh yes, because this is going to be the last round, so those two. Please. Please go ahead.
I'm Gotenga Bayo Chantal from Chad, but I'm working here at the JPIC, Justice and Peace Integrity of Creation in Washington, D.C. My question is about I'm learning English and I'm student at the school to learn English too, so excuse my English, but I will try. 50% of the linking that you talk about it, I can call it corruption. Be direct and need to be honest with myself when I know Africa, how IMF is doing and what IMF is preparing to stop that hemorrhage, I call it hemorrhage, to help to support really Africa, build a kind of real investment in that country that is not poor, but has a problem of management and a problem of understanding of using the resources of the country to build the country. So how IMF is doing to stop and really invest money where we can have a return of investment. Thank you.
So I'm also wondering what efforts are being made by IMF and other actors perhaps to ensure that forecasting and simulations can be perhaps a bit more responsible or caveated in a way that can help governments and the public understand the uncertainty around these sort of projections. Thank you.
Thanks. The last one before coming back to the meeting.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Barry Herman, Social Justice and Global Development. I wanted to refer back to the title of this session, Strengthening Civil Society Voices on Sustainable Debt and Development Policies in West and Central Africa. And I understand strengthening meaning make them stronger, okay? So my question is simply this, addressed to the AU, to IMF, and to the World Bank. What more can you do? What recommendations can you make to your bosses? I know our colleague from the AU is very concerned that some of his bosses are in the room, but still, what more can you do to strengthen the voice of civil society in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this was our last round. I'm going to ask you to think very sharply so that you can use 1 minute each to make your final comments, and we can try to respond to most that has been asked. So I'm going to start now.
I think from our perspective, especially the African Union, we really have been going through a scenario of honest self-criticism through the reforms of the African Union, which started sometime in 2017. And one of the key outputs of that is ensuring that when it comes to civil society participation, it's not simply from a matter of speaking on the corridors or at a side event, but actually being an integrated part of the policy and decision-making frameworks of the African Union. We have an organ that I'm representing, which is the Economic, Social and Cultural Council, which is the advisory organ of the African Union. It is comprised of civil society, and its main aim is to ensure that whenever there is any topic that is being discussed at African Union level, there is a substantive civil society intervention that is integrated into the policy decision makings of the African Union. And I think it would be important that it's not only governments that take ownership of it, but also civil society itself also takes ownership of this platform to be an impactful contributor with regards to implementing policy and effecting resolutions within the African Union framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm gonna touch upon the issue on the 50% of leakages and the corruption. At the fund, we started in recent years to roll out what we call the governance framework. And for the very first time in many years, probably in the history of the fund, we mentioned explicitly in our report the word corruption. We've kind of alluded to this for several years, for decades, but recently we started to roll out that framework of governance, and then we are really attacking the issue of corruption. And if you look at reports from the IMF in probably for the last year or two, you will see that many reports of the IMF have specific sections on governance, on corruption. So just to let us know that we think and we believe that corruption has become what we call a macro-critical issue, meaning if corruption persists, the whole macroeconomy may be endangered. So we are now getting into that area, and we are tackling governance and corruption in a very forceful way. Regarding gender, the IMF also has started to work on this issue. And if you look at the reports of the IMF for the last year or two, probably even 3 or so, you will see that many reports of the IMF also refer to gender. And we have what we call selective issues paper in our surveillance analysis with countries. Many reports include governance, and this is part of the agenda that has been brought out by the IMF in recent years. Regarding the help or the advocacy for CSOs, we strongly believe, as I mentioned earlier, that CSOs can play a crucial role in terms of getting the right balance between sustainable development and sustainable debt. In most countries that we go to, when we go on missions, we always try to do outreach to CSOs, to speak to CSOs, and we make the governments understand that we are discussing with CSOs, we are sharing information with CSOs, and we also encourage the governments to do so in those studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this has been a very rich session. A number of issues that are burning, I think, have come to the table. I have heard some quite provocative things, like having civil society as an implementing partner for some idea. This is some provocative ideas to push forward the civil society agenda. That's an interesting way of moving it forward. We have just heard that corruption should be thought as a macro-critical issue, which is an interesting approach to look at. And we have heard especially of the relevance of the topic of this session, strengthening the role of civil society, and that requires space, that requires support, and space means not being threatened, among other things. That's so important. It requires support, it requires respect, and it requires financing. So I think those are issues that are critical to make sure that this vital role can effectively be displayed and implemented. Another issue that has been raised very lightly, I think, but it's quite relevant, and it's this relation between taxes and debt, and the extent to which in this last decade we've seen that debt has been of easy access, because it's easier to sign a contract than to run a law through Congress, face all the economic policy obstacles, and try to get or curb the tax dodging that comes from big companies. It's much easier to get the money that will come easier. So this balance between tax and debt will need to get probably to a next level. And let me have the final word to just very modestly say, in the name of our host Aphrodite, that we don't want to have these panels with only men speaking. It was a very fair point in the room, so I have to apologize for that in name of our great colleagues from Aphrodite. Thanks everyone, thanks for the panel, thanks to the panelists, and let's continue to the next thing.